people, um, they might blame some other ethnicity or whatever. But the thing is, it's not really plausible that they'd be replaced by that other group of people. And so why do they feel like they're being replaced? And I think the answer is that every day on the news they're being told they're being replaced. And so what I want to do is dive into the way we think about technology. And the proposal I want to make is that this whole way of thinking of technology as something that can potentially make people obsolete is itself based on a mistake and a confusion. And that mistake and confusion has a whole interesting social and economic history, even a romantic history. Um, but it's fundamentally based on mistaken ideas in the first place. And if we can get our ideas a little straightened out, I think we might have a shot at reducing at least part of what ails us, which is this underlying feeling that people are vulnerable to being replaced by technology. Now, I should say that even those with the best intentions tend to buy into this narrative of replacement these days. For instance, some of the people talking about universal basic income have only the best intentions, and yet in the background of that idea is we need the universal basic income because people aren't going to be worth anything anymore to the economy, so they'll need to be supported. And so once again, there is underlying that this idea that, well, hey, you used to be worth something, now you're not. Now you're a charity case. And there's something about that that's very spiritually poisonous, I think, to people. Now, uh, where does this idea come from? It has a few interesting roots that I want to explore. The first one goes back to the 19th century and the spread of factories and industrialization. At that time, in the desire to make factories efficient, the workers in the factories started to be conceived of as robots. And indeed, if you look at the early rhetoric that led to the rise of Marxism and reactions against capitalism in that period, you'll see a kind of an early version of this replacement rhetoric and reaction against it that we see today. In 19th century factories, workers were thought of as being mechanisms that were supposed to be controlled with precise specifications. There was a notation for human movement designed to hack people, to specify what people would do bit by bit, called Levin notation, which survives today, oddly, in a totally different use as a tool for choreographers to document dances. But it was originally designed to precisely modulate the bodies of workers. Now, there are a few things to say about this phase of industrialization. One is, of course, it was anti human and horrible and demeaning, and it's completely understandable why people reacted so badly to it. But there's another thing to say about it, which is it didn't actually work very well. And in order to explain why it didn't work well, I want to talk about a later development that corrected it in the early 20th century. There was a guy named Deming that some of you might have heard of. Um, he's one of those people like Quincy in music who's just known by one name because he's such a powerful force. Deming was a scientist and engineer who looked at factories in terms of systems and in terms of information flow. And he thought, what we're doing here is really stupid. This is not the way to optimize a factory. And he came up with a method for improving the quality of factory output. And in fact, the term quality as applied to industrialization originates with him, and all the variations of it, the Six Sigma movement and all this stuff, originally come from Deming. There were a few different prongs of what he did. He was the first person to use statistics. Um, hold on. He was the first person to use statistics in a real-time feedback loop. So he would say, what is actually happening with the products coming from this factory? Can we can we look at the data and improve it? And so these days, of course, we use statistics and feedback in real time all the time, but at that time it was revolutionary. But he did two other things. One of them I'll mention in passing, which is was almost like a kindergarten culture, and perhaps in its own way a little demeaning in retrospect, where he would have all the workers get together and sing songs for their for their morale and stuff. But the third one is the one that really fascinates me the most. What he said is, you have all these people who are humans after all, they're intelligent, they have brains, they're actually making this stuff. Why don't we reveal to them the data from the statistics we're gathering and see if they have any ideas on how to improve what they're building instead of treating them as mindless robots? And that was a revolutionary idea. And he framed it in, he wouldn't have used the term spiritual, but I'll use it. He framed it in almost spiritual terms, where he said, as soon as a person becomes aware that what they're doing matters and is able to use their own volition to improve what they're doing, they gain a kind of depth of moral reality in the world. They gain a kind of a participation in society that's profound, where instead of just being pawns, they're real contributors. It creates a kind of a sense of responsibility, a sense of pride. It creates a moral force that should improve everyone. So his ideas did not take hold in the US. After World War II, however, they found an avid audience in Japan, of all places. Now, in the immediate post-war period, Japan had a very, very poor reputation in manufacturing. I'm old enough to remember that um, when I was growing up in the '60s, Japanese products had a reputation for being the very worst, the things that would fall apart. Japanese companies like Toyota adopted the Deming method and within a decade completely turned the tables and gained a reputation for the highest quality in the world. And this in turn had a profound impact on the world because it created the manufacturing model for the economic rise of Asia, which worked initially in Japan and then was copied by the Tigers, Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong, and then by Big China, of course, famously. And so it turns out these ideas, um, anything that happens on that larger scale has both good and bad qualities. And I'm very unhappy with modern day China on many levels, the Uyghurs, the Tibetans, etc. Um, on the other hand, how many times in history has a giant new force arisen in the world as peacefully as China has risen? And so it's a relatively peaceful model, and it all came from, well, not all, but it largely arose from the seed of this scientist looking at information flows in a factory and saying, wait a second, people aren't robots. People have dignity, people can contribute. Let's treat them like adults, give them responsibility, let's allow them to have pride, and things just got better. Now, why am I belaboring this point about Asian manufacturing and Deming? It's because uh, in our modern time, engineering and the production of objects, the production of technology, have become more and more computational. To a greater and greater degree, we're modeling everything. In some cases, such as with 3D printing, it's directly computational. And the more computational it gets, the more our model of how computation and data work really become the model of how everything works. And currently, we're treating people very much like 19th century factory workers. So if you ask, where does the data come from that molds and guides the algorithms that run everything, which we call the artificial intelligence algorithms, as if they're separate from people, they're this other intelligence. Where does the data come from? Well, it varies. There are different systems by which data gets into algorithms, but the most common one is that people are given a kind of a barter relationship where they give over their data in exchange for a free service, often a free service that isn't necessarily that important, like a service where you can post pictures of yourself in order to feel less sexy than other people who are posting pictures of themselves or whatever the hell it is. But at any rate, we have these things where people get addicted to services, their data's taken. And so it becomes very much like the 19th century situation where the person is not aware of how their data is being used. They have no ability, motivation, or understanding that would allow them to make their data better, to make the world better. They're completely removed from any connection or responsibility to the meaning of their data in the world. And that, I think, is a deplorable situation on multiple levels. I think it's deplorable spiritually because it sends the message that the intelligence is in the algorithm and entirely not in the data that drives the algorithm, which, and you can argue about the nuances, but surely that extreme statement cannot be correct. Surely the data matters at least a little. And it's deplorable because, as in the case of 19th century factories, it's dysfunctional because it removes human intelligence from the possibility of improving outcomes driven by humans. And the so one question to ask is there any alternative to doing things this way? And I think there is. We ended up in this very weird situation, and I've written about this a lot, so I won't go over it a great deal, but we've ended up in a situation where probably the majority of the biggest AI companies are driven by this barter model. Not all of them, but I would say like Google is, for instance, and Facebook is, for two prominent examples. And because Google is, then so's some of the AI efforts supported by Google, which are some of the central ones. And similarly, in the Chinese information world, the same model holds, although with different language. And so we have this very strange situation where if you look at a company like Google, it has kind of three identities depending on the direction from which you look at it. If you're a consumer and you look at it, it looks like a barter organization that offers you free services like search and YouTube videos and so on. If you're an investor, if you're from Wall Street, you think it's an advertising company, although perhaps a notch creepier than traditional advertising because it engages people in real-time behavior feedback loops, which I think is a different thing that shouldn't be legal, but let's leave that aside. But if you work inside Google and you look at it, it's an AI company that's getting all this data and is trying to make algorithms. Now, is there another way? And the answer is yeah, of course there is. Just as Deming pointed out that Toyota could improve its quality by giving people, I'm trying to turn off these questions. I find it really annoying. I'm not used to using Zoom. Is there any way I can get rid of these?
Just turn off the chat, I think. That's all you need to do.
No, they still pop up right in front of the screen.
Oh, yeah, okay. Tara, stop sending questions until Jaron's ready. That's the solution. Okay. We'll wait till you're ready to receive.
I would appreciate that because I find it a little distracting.
You got it.
All right, so let's see. Okay, so let's propose a different way to do this. Is it conceivable to imagine a world where people would be aware of what data they're producing, would have some ability to influence what happens with it, would have some ability to improve it if it's to a purpose? I think that world's conceivable. I'll sketch it for you now. A lot of this work has been done in collaboration with some of my colleagues, and I'll mention Glenn Weil especially. In order for workers to have effective voices, not only was it necessary for factory owners to appreciate that they could actually contribute, which is what happened with Toyota. In the bigger picture, they also gained a seat at the table and gained power through unions. And we think something like a union, although a little different, is the right structure to bring about a change in the relationship of people to technology. And for this idea of union has had different names in different publications. Sometimes it's called a data trust. I've been preferring the term MID, which stands for Mediator of Individual Data. A MID serves a number of functions, and I want to go over them with you because it's a kind of an interesting Swiss Army device that covers a number of things. One thing a MID does, which is important, is it gives people economic power. And this is a tricky point. We've gotten used to the idea that when we give data, we don't get paid for it. And in fact, when I suggest that people should get paid for their data, sometimes people say, oh, that would be terrible because it would encourage the poor to sell their souls and give out even more data and so forth. But the thing is, if you live in a market society at all, if you separate yourself from the market on some level, you disenfranchise yourself. And that's a concept you just have to get used to. Like, if we're going to reject markets and have a non-market society, that is perhaps another agenda, but you have to really do it. In that case, get rid of your Bitcoins and go for socialism. And I'm open to talking about a path to that. I've never seen one that I think really works. In principle, maybe it's the future. I don't know. But for the moment, of paths I can see from here to the future, I still see markets of different kinds. And if they're going to be markets, if you're not a full first-class participant in them, you are disenfranchised. Now, one of the interesting things about the union movement is that as soon as workers started to gain some power through collective bargaining, instead of maximizing their income, absolutely, they maximized a bundle of things, including income and also quality of life. So for instance, you started to get weekends, you started to get holidays, you started to get reasonable work hours, you started to even get leave for childcare, you started to get all of these limitations on the engagement in the workplace rather than maximizing it. And so I think it's reasonable to expect that unionization of data, rather than pulling people into ever more privacy violation, would in fact be the only way to have enough power to put a stop on privacy violation. Power and privacy go together, and without market participation in a market economy, you don't have power. So if you want, so it might sound counterintuitive, but it's precisely through monetizing data that it's plausible for people to have the power to modulate how much data they're giving. And it's really the only way in a market-driven economy. So I think the logic of that is sound. If it doesn't make sense to you, before you ridicule it, take some time to think it through. I think you'll come to agree that the logic is sound there. Another, just to state the obvious, if you don't have unionization, the value of data goes to zero. If it's each person against each other person, then everybody gets poor. And this is universally true in all market economies. There have to be little bubbles of cooperation, or else everybody destroys everybody if it's each against each. So for instance, if we believe in the labor capital divide, which I think is obsolete at this point, but if we believe in it, then on the capital side, you have corporations and partnerships for lawyers and all this. You have to have little bubbles of cooperation. And then, of course, on the labor side, you have unions. That doesn't change. And then when you have collective bargaining, suddenly data is worth something. I've been making this argument that people should be paid for data for quite a few years. And from early on, Facebook in particular developed a response to it that they've worked on quite a lot, in which they'll say, well, your data would actually only be worth nothing. You know, like your data would be worth pennies. It's nothing, except when we collate it. And when it's in our hands, then it's worth, you know, tech, if tech companies own your data, it's worth trillions of dollars. If you own it, it's worth nothing. That's been this sort of absurd state of affairs that's treated as normal. And of course, if unionized people are giving the data, then it is worth something when people have it, and that just has to happen. Now, the idea of the mid accomplishes a couple of other things, and this is really important. One of the things is that since early modern times in common law, there's been this concept of a fiduciary responsibility, and that is when somebody has more knowledge or power over you than you can have over yourself, they take on a responsibility to serve only your interests. And traditionally, some examples of people who take on this responsibility are doctors, who are responsible to serve the patient, not the pharmaceutical or the hospital or something. Lawyers, who are responsible to serve the client and not somebody else. And certain financial advisors, et cetera. Now, in the case of algorithms, in the case of this digital world, you have the explicit implementation of behaviorist algorithms that are designed to manipulate people, and without their knowledge. Facebook proudly published academic articles that were peer-reviewed, proving they could make multitudes of people sad without the people knowing why they were made sad, and so on. So you clearly have a situation where you have one entity that has power over an individual that the individual doesn't have. And yet the tricky thing is there's no entity in position to have fiduciary responsibility, which is kind of crazy. One of the things about that is that you can't have a universal fiduciary. For instance, you can't have one lawyer representing everybody because people have competing interests. That's why you have lawyers representing different people. Even in medicine, you might have two patients who come into conflict in wanting a limited resource or something, and the doctors have to advocate for those patients. You can't have a universal fiduciary without having some kind of weird dictatorship that just controls everybody. And so you have to have some entity in the modern information world that can serve in the fiduciary role. Facebook cannot be your fiduciary, it's universal, but a MID can be. So what the MID can do is the MID can say, I don't represent everybody. I represent a group of people who through free association have chosen to band together, and they now have representation. Their interests are being represented. And another crucial piece of that is complexity management. The modern digital world is extremely complex. I'm relatively skilled in it, I would think, and yet I just find it intolerable to take the amount of time I would have to really make sure I'm not being spied on, that I really have cleaned out my system all the time, et cetera, et cetera. It's just like, it's just too fucking complicated to keep up with. So the MID can take on that duty. The MID can become a trusted source. Then there's another thing about MIDs, and here, I was just talking earlier about the 19th century moving into the Deming Revolution and quality. I want to talk about something else that some of you might have heard of, which is more from the turn of this century, which is called microlending and the Grameen Bank. So this might seem like a pretty sharp turn, but just bear with me here. There's a guy named Mohammed Yunus, who's really cool. He's from Pakistan. I'm sorry, Bangladesh. Pardon me, Bangladesh. And he's I know him. He won a Nobel for this, actually, a Nobel in economics. No, wait, it might have been a Peace Prize, actually. Anyway, Mohammed had this idea. He was concerned with this question of how do you take impoverished communities and in places like Bangladesh and parts of Africa and so on, and get some credit to them so people can start small businesses and start to create economic improvement that's decentralized. How do you do it? And one of the problems, one of the difficulties has been that if some entity like a bank is going to extend credit to someone, they have to assess the creditworthiness of that party. Because without credit, if you just lend out money or extend credit, you will likely be unpaid and the whole thing will collapse. So how do you establish credit for somebody who has no credit history, who's impoverished? And he fell upon a rather simple solution, which is you distribute trust. In this way, it actually reminds me a little bit of some blockchain schemes that are much more recent. He said, okay, instead of a single person applying for a loan, people will form together into little groups through free association, and they'll vouch for each other. So if any one person in the group defaults on a loan, the rest will also be responsible for it. So people suddenly became picky about who they connected with. They connected with people they knew, and these groups turned out to be incredibly trustworthy. The Grameen Bank, this first experimental bank doing this type of micro lending, had better repayment rates than all the fancy rich world banks, and so this was just an incredible revolution, and it was just based on the very simple idea of distributing trust instead of trying to centralize the assessment of trust. An incredibly simple idea that combined a lot of different ideals about the best way of thinking about markets, the best way of thinking about democracy, and just giving people dignity. Admitting that people are actually smart and basic, most of them are decent, and that they can think for themselves. Now, the reason I'm telling you the story of the Grameen Bank, and by the way, there are some criticisms of microlending. It's been around for a while, and it's not the ultimate panacea for development. So I don't want to claim that it's an absolute utopia or anything, but the fundamental mechanism works. Now, if we look at the online world today, one of the horrible things about it is that it seems to elevate bad stuff more than good stuff. Okay, so you have this pure attention economy where people just want to be noticed, and so it's easier to get noticed as a jerk, or to put it in scientific terms, it's easier to gain and maintain attention if you excite the fight or flight responses in others. And so you tend to have a lot of inflammatory, disturbing stuff online that tends to get naturally amplified by the algorithms that adjudicate who sees what. And this happens over and over again. An example, so YouTube denies it, but when I've tried to replicate published research myself, I see exactly the same result. If you let the Google algorithm start representing, by the way, that's Potato the cat behind me walking on the instruments. He'll have his opinions, I'm sure, in a second. The YouTube algorithm will tend to start from any point, whether it knows who you are or not, and after somewhere in the teens, usually, I find around 15 to 17 links of recommendations, you end up in some weird, paranoid, kind of creepy video. And the reason why is just that those excite the fight or flight responses. The algorithms notice people are being excited, and so they get recommended. The same thing's true in all the other social media systems that are algorithmically mediated. This has created a universe of highly cranky individuals, cranky, paranoid, on edge, desperate for attention. There's a certain kind of personality type that we become familiar with. My hope is that we're gradually overcoming it. I feel that some of the recent social protests in the United States, like Black Lives Matter, have been less reactive on that level. And I feel like there's an emerging, I don't know what to call it, an emerging familiarity or perhaps maturity with the current system that's very encouraging. But nonetheless, it still is kind of like, just if you look at the United States response to the pandemic, the stupid, paranoid, ridiculous stuff has dominated good quality medical information. I've been accosted for wearing a mask, and I know many other people have, just in public, which is going to be remembered historically as one of the all-time stupid things in human history. Like, what could be stupider than that? And that's driven by this weird, paranoid, irritable thing. And so, so I want to combine this observation about our current culture as it's been mediated by algorithms that prefer things that tweak the fight or flight responses. I want to combine that with the solution from the Grameen Bank and microlending. What if, instead of individuals posting on things like Twitter or whatever, people form through free association into little groups, into little micro publishers where they watched out for each other. And they created essentially a brand where they were responsible for one another. So once again, this is through free association. If you want to get together with a bunch of jerks, totally free to. And then what that does is it distributes the process of decency so that people would publish as a member of, it would be like being a member of a little underground zine in the old days, or a member of an indie band maybe, or something like that. You'd create a little identity, and then people would look out for each other. And if somebody's going to become an all-out jerk and say something incredibly stupid, their buddies are going to say, hey, wait a second, that's hurting me too. Let's just think this through for a second. And then they can either split. If the band wants to break up, that's fine. But there's this mechanism, there's this little thing in place that's based on human consideration that I don't think interferes with free speech at all. It's through free association. It's just a layer to inject some human responsibility along with the freedom. Now, what I want to propose is that this grouping could also be the mid. The mid could also create this structure, this coarse-grained structure to promote quality. Now, this idea that civilization isn't just made of a bunch of individuals, but of groups of individuals, that there's a coarse-grainedness to things, is very fundamental. I want to, if you look at the literature of people who've tried to compare societies that are relatively peaceful and decent with societies that fall apart and fail, you'll always come across this phrase of societal institution. And I think some particularly good writers on this topic are Hannah Arendt and de Tocqueville, if you know who those people are. And societal institutions are precisely the type of thing I've been talking about. They're free association, quality maintaining groupings. And then if I think in this context, I can be permitted to nerd out a little bit. In any large learning system, there has to be some sense of coarse-grained accumulation of knowledge. In evolution, we call it a species. We don't just have a gloop of genes moving back and forth between things. We have genes forming into structures that have surfaces around them so that you can have larger scale experiments. And then you get cats. Without that, you wouldn't get cats or people. So that's coarse graining and evolution. In computer science, it's the internal layers of a learning network. You can't just have a single layer machine learning network. You need to have multiple layers. And the reason is you need coarse-grained accumulation for larger scale experiments within the learning system, so in the abstract system, the internal layer is like the mid, is like the species, sort of. So what I would argue is that this coarse-grainedness is a thing that is the reason why society has turned to crap in this era. When you have only Facebook and a bunch of individuals, you destroy coarse-grainedness. When Facebook's early slogan, "Move fast and break things," was precisely breaking these coarse-grained structures in civilization. And then without distributed trust, without distributed attention to decency, without distributed attention to quality, the worst comes out of people, which is why you can get attacked for wearing a mask on the street, which is so astonishingly stupid. What I'm trying to build here is an overall picture in which we would recreate societal institutions where people would have distributed trust through free association in groups. These groups would collectively bargain for the value of data. These groups, mids, would have enough power to have a seat at the table. People would gain a view into what their data is being used for and would be able to make their data better. Now, I haven't gone back to that as much. If you go back to the origins of the idea, this is a whole amazingly long and complex saga that really should be some kind of incredible movie series or something. But from the very earliest days of computers, there was kind of this schism in how to think about computers. And I'm old enough to have directly known the first generation of people who argued about this, or at least some of them. There were some figures who thought the computer was a new life form apart from people and should be almost worshipped that way. My most important mentor was probably Marvin Minsky, who might have been the person who did the most to articulate that point of view. And then opposed to that point of view were people who thought that the computer wasn't necessarily anything by itself, but was more a new way, a new tool in which people work together. The first important figure in that was probably Norbert Wiener, who wrote a book called The Human Use of Human Beings, which ends with this remarkable thought experiment about how maybe, and this is in the like 1950 or something, it's like really long ago. It ends with this thought experiment that maybe someday there'd be radio wirelessly connected computers, and everybody would have one of these computers, and the computers could enact behavior modification algorithms, and the society would go crazy and then be extinguished. And it's a route to extinction comparable to nuclear weapons. And this was like way back, which is of course more or less what we're doing. And then some of the other figures, Doug Engelbart, who invented the computer mouse, was an extremely articulate and vocal proponent of the computer isn't really anything, and it's just people working with people. And he tried to re-term AI as augmented intelligence, that the computer's just augmenting what people can do rather than being its own thing separately. And there's been kind of, I'm very firmly on the Wiener Engelbart side. And then there's been this whole other AI thing, which is kind of one, I think the reason the AI thing won so much is that, I mean, I used to argue with Marvin, my mentor, because he was like the most pro AI person in history, and I'm super anti AI in terms of that conception. We used to argue. The last time I saw him before he died, one of his other students called me and said, Marvin's very frail. Don't go and argue with him about AI, And I showed up and he looked up and he said, "Are you ready to argue?" And I'm like, "Oh, hell yeah." And he loved it. We used to love arguing. But what would happen is once in a while, when it came time to talk to the funders, and a lot of the funders were from the military, he would say, "Okay, Jaron, you can shut down your anti-AI stuff for the moment. Let's just play along because we need funding for the lab." And then more or less, if you go to somebody in the military and you say, "Hey, these machines, Skynet's going to come alive and whoever owns Skynet is going to run the world," they're like, "Oh yeah, here's your money." It was a pretty easy pitch. And that's part of how the AI side gained so much ascendance in recent years. It's just like you can scare people pretty easily. It's also very flattering. It's like you're creating this new life. It almost puts the computer scientist into a godlike position. But anyway, the thing is, speaking from the others, like if I'm behind the curtain being a computer scientist at a tech company, which I also am, we get all this data in, and the people don't know what the data is for. So it's kind of like low quality data. Like, I'll give you an example. Right now, you've probably had the experience of trying to get onto some website and they'll say, "Oh, wait a second, we need to prove you're human." So you're going to play the eCAPTCHA game, and then you have to identify things on a street, like what's a street light or what's a bicycle or something. The reason you're doing that is you're working for free for Google and giving them, you're tagging examples of images to help them in their self-driving car quest. Okay, but the thing is, that's really stupid. Like, let me point out a better world. A better world is one in which people who actually drive for a living, like truck drivers, are being told, "Listen, there's going to be self-driving trucks, but in the meantime, your generation can make a lot of money programming the self-driving trucks, and then we'll have time to transition to another thing for the next generation. What are the situations you worry about? This is what you're doing." Like, instead of, like, give them the agency to tag what really matters to tag the situations that are actually dangerous, like actually bring them into agency, bring them into pride and making the thing better, get them paid for it to fund the transition to when we have more automated vehicles. Then we get better quality automated vehicles, we get them more robustly, people have more pride, and legitimately so, honestly so, and we have a better economic transition. I mean, everything about it gets better. The tech gets better, the human side gets better, everything gets better. And yet instead, they're obsoleting themselves gradually and in a fumbling way with CAPTCHA without even understanding why they're doing it. I mean, it's sort of triple stupid on multiple layers that we're doing things this way. It's not good for anybody in the loop. Now, I mentioned I'm at a tech company. I'm not representing them here, but I also, I'm a scientist at Microsoft. And these days I'm called, wait, what is it? Office of the Chief Technology Officer, Prime Unifying Scientist, and it spells out octopus, which is a joke on my hair. So I'm Microsoft's octopus, and we're trying a couple of things. You can, if you look it up online, we have a thing called Trove, which is an early experiment in trying to set up a way that people can look for data that algorithms need. They can participate in making the data better. They can bargain for what they get paid for it. And it's it's an interesting experiment, because if you look at how AI algorithms are done right now, you tend to either get a bunch of free data, like from eCAPTCHA, that is kind of a little off the mark and you can't really quite use it for what you want, and it's a little awkward, and it's spiritually ugly for the people. Or you can pay a data broker a shitload of money and it becomes uneconomical. And there's a sweet spot in between that I think is win-win, where people get paid enough for their data that they're not being displaced, and they're in charge of their own privacy, and they have agency, they have a seat at the table, but at the same time, the data quality gets better, so the algorithms get better at the same time. I think there's a win-win. I know 5 minutes, I'm gonna be done. And so we're doing some early experiments to find that sweet spot, and I feel like there's some cases where we found it. I think we need to reconceive of the idea of AI. It's so commonplace in the culture. There's been so much science fiction that thinks of AI as this thing, as this other entity that's taking over. We see it in the Matrix movies, and over again, there's like AI is like this entity that's coming for us, and it's just spoken of that way matter-of-factly, but it doesn't have to be that way. We can think of aggregate intelligence, we can think of associative intelligence, we can think of augmented intelligence, we can think of all kinds of other conceptions in which the idea is that it's a new form of collaboration between people. It's a way of people knowingly, through free association, working together better by intentionally creating data to make better algorithms for the mutual good and for the individual good, to make some money from it too, which as if we're going to be in a market economy, you have to respect. And I think I think we need to reconceive of AI, bring dignity back to people, and understand technology as a wonderful human activity rather as something that will replace people. And I think if technologists can shift their own culture, my prediction is like magic. We're going to see a lot of other people being less freaked out and less reactive to modernity than we're currently seeing. That's enough. I'm done. I'm 2 minutes ahead of time. How about that?
Well, that's pretty awesome. Thank you for all of those thoughts. There are a lot of good things worth thinking about. There's so many problems that are being exacerbated in the world by so-called social media right now, and I think you nailed some of the reasons why it's so powerfully so. And it's really cool to hear some, for maybe so rarely anyways, if not the first time, some solutions of things to experiment with to try to move forward in a positive way to bring us back to a place where we can, possibly talk to one another with nuanced conversations. And, you and Marvin Minsky could argue about things even though you're on polar opposites and remain friends until on his deathbed, right? And and back when we used to argue all night, we didn't see eye to eye on a lot of things, but did that matter? That's part of what makes life interesting. That's part of what makes friendships. That's part of what makes us live and grow and learn and become better. So and we do that individually, collectively. So yeah, the idea of mid and putting that together with market economy, which isn't going away all that quickly, is some interesting food for thought. Thank you.
Well, cool. Thanks for listening.
Yeah.
Okay, no.
What about this guy? I think this guy now works. And if I turn off desktop audio, there should be no more echo. What about this guy? I think this guy now works. And if I turn off desktop audio... Yeah, there we go. Okay. So that was the keynote. I think what I wrote in chat that the keynote is firmly on the wiener is probably the best summary of this. I sadly, dead serious, could not pay too much attention to the keynote. I was picking up notes in my head. I just have a hard time articulating it. I might be talking about it like later throughout the day. The irony is that I actually got accepted for a lightning talk at Hope. So I'm going to go AFK for a moment, and then you're going to see me do some final setup, and we're going to load in Zoom, and I'm going to be streaming this lightning talk along with my actual presentation. So just give me one more moment because I'm going to rehydrate. This is going to be really fun. The shirt kind of gives a hint because today is National New Jersey Day. So give me one moment here. See, I told you guys that would be really quick. The transition didn't even fully complete. So yeah, I got accepted into a lightning talk, and what I'm going to do now is I got all these links and I have these notes. I'm going to kill a couple of things here, and then I'm going to we're going to then load into Zoom real quick because unfortunately that's what they're going to be using during the lightning talks. See. Oh, did I put the wrong thing in first? Yeah, I did. Oh well. Alright, so I need to go back further in time here and skip one tab. Because we got accepted for the lightning talk thing, I feel like at the last minute. And I don't even have slides. I literally have images in a browser because I'm about to drop some fun info on everyone. We're going to see if I can actually fit this all in 1 minute. That's actually going to be the amusing part here, is doing that. So I know it doesn't seem like it's really glamorous right now, but I want to make the slides kind of a surprise. The slides, because again, we're not even really using slides. Why is it glitching? There we go. I can't tell if it's on the stream, but I know on my machine there's a little bit of an echo. I actually should be able to solve that temporarily by just muting in general. There we go. I'm just going to kill these tabs to bring up more space. Okay. This is going to be so much fun. Like, this is literally basically a talk that I've been wanting to do for a while now. That would be full featured when we were going to work on stuff for the government in Jersey City. But I've instead decided do a little preview of it by basically doing it as a lightning talk. And if you guys don't know, today is National New Jersey Day. And what I'm basically going to talk about is I'm going to talk about, as quick as I can, all the different fun factoids about hacking and technology in New Jersey. Preview this audio.
Don't know? I'm getting sued by Sony.
Okay, that video works. So I'm going to do that, and then we're going to log into the Zoom here. Just want to make sure everything else loaded properly. Yes, it did. I'm actually going to preset this. Here we go. Okay, everything should be properly loaded now. Unfortunately, I think my notes are also going to show on the screen. So I'm going to shrink myself down again. Let's put a proper first slide here. There we go. And now we are going to, we actually temporarily take off the Hope 2020 capture, and we're going to attempt to get into this Zoom chat now. So I believe I have it loaded on this machine, provided the machine wants to listen to me. Oh, no, I did this through the web browser. This makes sense. Okay, I'm still going to close this. And as much as it pains me to do, I'm also just going to close this entire feed here, and we're going to pray that we don't have any other problems that I have to bring this up for. Because that's definitely taking a lot of resources. So I'm going to go into this. So yeah, I'm sorry for the non-exciting stream right now. I'm literally getting ready for the lightning talk, and hopefully I've made it on time. So, and I'm going to quickly comb my hair because my hair is absolutely nuts. Just want to go into my notes, and okay, everything's all here. Okay. going to solve this terrible CAPTCHA. This is a first. Chimneys. Chimney cricket. So now we're just in the waiting queue here. And hopefully we'll be accepted on. I'm going to turn back on this since now there's no more sensitive information. It's connecting now. Let's remind myself what microphone I'm using. Okay, I'm using the USB one. Yeah, if you're wondering what's going on, it's because I can't hear the channel now. I don't know why. I hope that's not going to interfere with what's going on, so let's cross your fingers here.
Companies like, for example, I'm showing there Amazon, Google, and Facebook, which control our daily lives and um all the implications they have digitally. And well, we have a choice to not use them. We have free alternatives, but the point is that they have become so deeply entrenched in our daily lives that, for example, the other day I wanted to play a game with my girlfriend and I couldn't because I had to use one of Google's CAPTCHA, and some other times we want to see a blog from one person on the internet, but they have Facebook cookies and stuff like that. They have so much control right now in our daily lives that it's become very difficult for us to stray away from them. And well, the idea is that, well, this is not our fault. We, as I said, we have most of the times no choice of escaping. They have they can control what we think because, well, they can choose the first results we see when we search for something on Google, or the things that appear in our timeline on Twitter. And that's why I've been working on a project called Future. It's a search engine that's powered by a deep learning algorithms that I've been training on my house. It is self-hosted. Also in my house, I have the an old computer running the server in the basement. And well, the idea is to make an open source search engine, and I'm looking right now for ways in which I can make shards of the information that is being crawled, so that uh, different devices can act like a hive that powers
Okay, from what I
the
understand,
search
we
engine.
might have to
You can
pause the live
find
stream,
the
so we're gonna
GitHub
find
repo
out.
there, and there is also the link to the web page. Well, thank you very much.
Perfect. Good. Thanks for leading off the lightning talk. And for those of you that don't know, this is the big winner of Hackers Got Talent, the first edition from last Saturday night. So we're going to do Hackers Got Talent again next Saturday. We're planning on doing lightning talks again as well in a couple of days. So stay tuned. All right. Well, thank you very much. You don't need to stay in the conference anymore, I don't think, but the chat room is open. So people that have any comments, input, you can go to the live stream sessions Q&A chat room in Matrix and have discussion with the speaker.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks again. And up next is Side Pocket. Are you ready? Go ahead and unmute your video, unmute your audio, Side Pocket, and you can go ahead and share.